So 28 years ago, I was at Syracuse and I saw a poster and it had this word on it, entrepreneur. And as Jeff had said, I started my first company when I was 13, but I just never heard of this word entrepreneur before. And all of a sudden it was blinking in my face. I was a computer science major and I just completely lost it. I was so enamored with that word. It was like a moniker that all of a sudden it said, this is me. It was like born again. I just had to know everything about it. And I researched it and read a lot about it. And then when I went to the university to ask them if I could have a degree in this, after the dean stopped laughing and told me there's no such thing and it's not a discipline, I was never quite good with the word no, so I just kept pushing and pushing and pushing until I finally was able to get them to let me do this. And that led me on this journey. And one of the things in my ultimate definition, I've asked many people around the world, what's your definition of an entrepreneur? And my answer, after lots of experience personally and after lots of meeting people and researching, is an entrepreneur will do anything to keep from getting a job. So, as I think about this question of, what's the big idea, and what can we do both as educators and as an ecosystem around entrepreneurship, I look at it in two major categories. There's the startup, so how can we accelerate more people to become entrepreneurs, but more important than just getting numbers of people, what I think is critical is getting larger numbers of people who succeed larger and faster. And I think when you start to put those elements to it, it changes what the programs have to do to actually accomplish this objective. Well, the second issue, though, that I think is equally important is what I'll call the speed up side of it. There is millions and millions of businesses out there, most of which are small businesses, and many of them which are entrepreneurial. The ability to double the workforce through getting these companies to be more successful is a lot easier than getting a lot more companies to get started. And I think that the institutions have done a terrible job at being able to reach out. And so one of the ideas I'm going to give you today is something I think that we, from an institutional perspective, can really play a key role in to try to help on the speed up side of it in addition to the startup side. So the first thing I'll say is that as I've watched the entrepreneurial ecosystem develop over the last 28, 29 years, I generally give it a D. I think it has done overall a fairly poor job. And back in the 80s when we were first really driving this whole process, a lot of it was about the right goal, which I believe is that a mission of an entrepreneurship program at a university should only have two missions. One is to graduate entrepreneurs, and the second is to accelerate entrepreneurial ventures, period. If you look at most of the websites of most of the programs here and the other ones that are around the country, majority of them talk about the research that they're doing and about the ecosystem and all kinds of other garbage that has nothing to do with the customer that all of you have, which I believe is the most important, is the student. And so, I think people need to start focusing on scaling their institutions and on really focusing on the outcomes of the student. And in looking at that, it's not just about having random courses. We need to start rethinking how the educational process is because, the best entrepreneurs typically are coming out of the engineering and the sciences and the arts type programs. When we graduate and we become entrepreneurs, we then oftentimes hire the business students. It's not, in my opinion and my experience in watching literally thousands and thousands of entrepreneurs, most of them aren't coming out of the business schools, they're coming out of the other programs. And so, a lot of the programs in entrepreneurship are embedded in the business schools, and it's so difficult to get them to work together. So you might offer a class or two, but we're not really integrating into the vertical aspect to get the students that might be in the engineering program, if they choose what they want to become an entrepreneur, to actually design with the end process of them becoming an entrepreneur from the very beginning and building in both an academic and a practicum-based program. There's way too much academics in this, and we don't have the, what I'll call the laboratory. When I was a computer science major, every day I was working on writing programs. And every Thursday night, for the most part, I was up all night writing my programs. My friends who were in the architecture, they were building models and drawing. My friends that were in, pre-med, they're working on cadavers and whatever else they're working on. But most of the entrepreneurship, we sit around in classes and maybe we talk about cases, but we're not practicing what needs to be done. We're not actually creating the businesses. In some places like Babson and Acton, and a couple are doing some of the right things, but not enough are going far enough. And so I want programs to be thinking about all of the different practical-based educational experiences that they can do to give them, your school stores and businesses on campus. Those should be run by and should be absolutely part of the curriculum. How can a student not be working in a business and being an entrepreneur while they're a student if they're learning in that program? Students are graduating, and for the most part, whether they start a company at that point or soon thereafter, they're starting these companies without ever typically seeing more than 1 or 2 or 3 offices. They don't even know what furniture to buy. They don't know whether they should have closed offices or open space environments. They don't know if they should give free food or whether they should have beanbags all over the place. They haven't had the visual and the experiential activities. The engineers have no idea what sales is. They have no idea what human resources is. By the time they graduate, they should have visited dozens of companies and gone deep dives going into the divisions to find out exactly what software they use to run those. What kind of people are they ultimately going to be hiring? Like, what does an HR manager look like? They don't have those experiences. They might write a business plan, but they're not negotiating term sheets and definitive agreements. They're not studying exactly whether they should be an S Corp, a C Corp, or an LLC. So their decision on what sort of corporate structure typically is based upon total luck on what attorney they end up meeting and what that attorney happens to like. They don't have the basic skills necessary to succeed. So what happens is, if you look at most successful entrepreneurs, the business that you end up knowing them by is not their first business. It's almost impossible to find somebody who's very successful where that company was their first company. Why? Because we have to fail. But I think what the educational institution needs to do is be able to make the failures, give them the experiential opportunities to fail in college as much as possible, so by the time they get out, the trajectory that they go on is hopefully much faster. So the last part and the big idea, the first is a challenge, which is to rethink your educational programs. But the opportunity tied to that is in the speed-up process. I think the idea that you had about going to Technion is great, but I think that there is hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of companies throughout this country that have the opportunity to expand dramatically, but the entrepreneur or the small business person who's running them just doesn't know how to go to the next step, or they've been living in a cocoon and they don't realize what they even have available. And we've got assets sitting in these colleges that are unbelievable assets, brilliant students who could be applied to go find those companies, do a search throughout your communities to find the businesses that are there that have the big opportunity to grow, and then give your students the opportunity to get in there and make it happen. This is not happening enough. It's the opportunity, I think, to double our businesses without having to go and start that many more.